Hello, PerfBytes listeners. Satan here with a special introduction for you highly talented evildoers from the internet services sector of the technology industries. You know, over the never-ending years of my evil technology inventions, I've never quite found a more elegant or comprehensive way to punish innocent end users than your recent system-wide outages here in the summer of 2013. Even I must admit how sincerely impressed I am with the high quality of so many damned outages in such a short time. Hats off to you guys. Even though I don't really wear hats, it's just an all-too hipster look for a guy my age, especially with the horns and the hair and... Anyway, welcome to an entire PerfBytes episode of The News of the Damned.
Can you dig it?
What the is PerfBytes? The fourth square meal of the day. Don't bookmark PerfBytes. Waffles, microwave ready. Blobbity blah, blobbity blah. Add nutritional value to your brain. It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson and James Pulley. PerfBytes. Whatever.
Hey, it is time once again for PerfBytes, and this is an entire PerfBytes episode dedicated to the news of the damned because it's actually been an insane period of time. In just the last 2 weeks, there have been countless, more than I can count on both hands. And I can count, more than two outages across the internet. And my usual luxurious host, James Pulley. James, you're in Minneapolis right now, aren't you?
I am. I am in the city of happiness.
The city of happiness here in the middle of the land of 10,000 lakes. And we have joining us again a special guest, Mr. Black Falcon Consulting, John Curtis. John, welcome to PerfBytes.
Thanks, Mark. So good to be back.
Oh, it's absolutely. And just to remind people that they may not know what News of the Damned is, it's a special segment we do in every show if you've never heard of it, but it's the premise that Satan himself has done a lot of horrible things in the world, and caused pestilence, plagues, terrible floods, and
famines.
Famines. I think he created diet soda, which with the aftertaste, it's just the aftertaste part of diet soda.
I think he was involved in OS2 as well.
In OS2, so he was probably one of the junior developers of OS2 back in the day. But even Satan has a hard time keeping up with some of us in the IT department when it comes to ruining the quality of life here on planet Earth, especially the online life that so many of us enjoy. So before we launch into that, this barrage of amazing outages. There are some news items, James, I understand we should probably cover before we dive in the deep end of outage land.
Yeah, very abbreviated news segment this week. Number one, SOSTA announced a new product, Touch Test Lite. So if you are looking for a solution for automated functional testing on your mobile devices, and you don't want to buy a device or rent a rack of devices, or you're concerned about whether it works for iPhone, Android, whatever, go up, take a look at the latest offering from SOSTA. The Lite series tends to be very inexpensive to get involved. See if it'll work with your technology, and maybe you'll look at some of their richer offerings. So that's Touch Test Lite, announced August 20th. I was actually at the SOSTA offices that next day.
Yeah, I think the eval, Fred Behringer, shout out to Fred, I actually was on the webinar, which covered, I think, the top 5 mobile testing challenges. It was actually hands-on you can get in a webinar. It was a really good webinar, actually. Covered many of those things. So Fred and Brad cranked that out. I kept him busy with some questions as best I could. But he's using Touch Test, and like Cloud Test Lite has been around for a while. So now this is the mobile functional testing version. But you can get performance stats out of the handheld device right from Touch Test. It's actually pretty sweet.
Yeah, it is very, very sweet. The next one is courtesy of John. VMworld is ongoing this week. It can't be a summer without having a user conference someplace.
That's right.
This time, San Francisco, California, 25th through the 29th. And while you're there, go visit and cross the New Bay Bridge.
Yes.
And lastly, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer is going to resign.
Oh.
if you think of Microsoft in terms of generations, you got Generation Zero, which is Gates and that generation of evangelist, architect, developer, business owner. And then Ballmer came a little bit later. You know, Gates didn't graduate college. Ballmer graduated and was working for Procter & Gamble.
Yep.
Ironically, they produce a lot of shampoo. If you've seen Steve Ballmer, shampoo, little challenge there.
Yeah, sure.
So I think this is a very interesting industry news item. We all have our opinions on Microsoft's latest offerings. From one gentleman I heard recently who looked at the color scheme on the latest version of Office and just was like, gray on gray on gray. Gee, you know, Microsoft makes me sad. All the way up to RT. Really? What does that do for me as a business person? John, Mark, what's your thoughts here?
Well, I'll go first. I think Microsoft has made amazing strides forward with the Windows Phone 8 operating system, and having a single user interface that's similar from desktop to tablet to mobile makes a lot of sense. Windows RT doesn't make a lot of sense. That's my take.
Yeah, I think mobile probably would be a good place to go. So I think you could look at the Nokia CEO, Stephen Elop, right? Yeah, that
I don't
could
know,
be there.
sorry.
So from a mobile perspective, the Nokia CEO might be good if they're going to continue going down the mobile route. But I heard news that maybe somebody recommended that Mark Hurd should take over Microsoft because generationally they would be the same. And secondarily, I think Mark Hurd was a better tennis player than Ballmer, which is really good.
But Mark, will this heal the rift between Oracle and Microsoft if Mark Hurd leaves Oracle and his really good friend Larry Ellison to go be CEO of Microsoft?
Yeah, but Hurd knows how to do some partnerships, right? So he's already talked to Ballmer about doing some stuff with Oracle in the cloud and some of this kind of stuff. So I don't know if that's bearing fruit yet, but I tell you, another thing that would be really hip is, you know, Microsoft recently acquired Skype. And Skype's CEO, Tony Bates, that would be a cool move. If you actually took the guy that's about sort of social interaction and put that person in charge from a pure software play, I mean, that would be huge.
Mark, both you and I are Microsoft alums.
It's true.
I think we've both agreed in the past that they have made some what we feel are pretty serious missteps, and you know they've made some very good steps in the market as well. But you know, they've got some real black eyes on their end user interface of late, particularly with growth in other operating systems outstripping their core Windows brand. So they've got to address that no matter what happens.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a huge coincidence here. This notice of Ballmer resigning happens after the problems with Outlook.com.
So let's jump into it, right? So this is we usually take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do a News of the Damned on a PerfBytes episode, but there have been a dozen outages just within the last 2 weeks of some of the biggest names in online internet services. We're talking big names, Microsoft you just mentioned, and huge media outlets. The New York Times is down, right? Infrastructure vendors like Google are going down. Amazon, e-commerce. So the poster child for we're going to do e-commerce better than anyone else, Amazon.com, goes down. It's amazing. We've got online banks. It's not just the U.S. A lot of these are U.S.-based companies. So granted, most of them are hosted all around the world. We've got a bank in Australia that went down, and not just once. They kept going down and on, down again, and try to fix it down again. This is unbelievable. So let's start off with the first one that we want to talk about here on the list. And John Curtis, you actually kind of mapped this out over the last 2 weeks.
That was the most frightening part of all, Mark, is to see how closely some of the largest failures occurred. We're used to seeing them happening. Once every week or so, you'll get a newsworthy item. In this case, we were trying to fit them all on one page. So they were so plentiful.
Yeah, and so to kick things off, we've got Microsoft themselves. Now, Microsoft we'll give them high marks for being very transparent about what went wrong. So, John, I think you researched a little of this. Why don't you share some more of how Outlook.com really took a dive. Actually, it wasn't just Outlook.com, right?
Correct. Also, along with Outlook.com, they also lost their people services as well as SkyDrive.
Oh, my God.
So when you talk about cloud services, it was more than just the cloud email. It was also their cloud storage as well. And what wasn't terribly transparent was the description that Microsoft gave later of how they corrected the problem. And they described two corrections that would fix this problem. One was increasing bandwidth, which to those of us, James and Mark, we've been in the performance environment long enough that seldom do we hear that bandwidth is a real problem for services like this. But okay, take that.
Well, John, I want to take issue with that, because if you talk to any developer and you find that their application is slow, the first thing they blame is the network.
Right. But what they find out, of course, is that it's not the bandwidth that's the problem. But the implication from Microsoft was that it wasn't bandwidth to SkyDrive, it was bandwidth to the ActiveSync server. Okay. Which is sort of interesting when you think about what ActiveSync does and how bandwidth would solve it. Yeah. And they said the second fix was an improvement to the way ActiveSync servers handled error conditions. But that was about the extent of the description of how they fixed the problem. And the funny thing was, one of the interesting tidbits, one of the leaks was that they said that the major problem that triggered the Exchange ActiveSync issue was smartphones having problems connecting to ActiveSync when they first started experiencing an issue, and then attempting to reconnect frequently and rapidly. So it was a surge of reconnection attempts from mobile devices.
Kind of like a rollback storm. Like you roll back, but the recovery process is instantaneous and constant versus, well, try once and then wait 2 seconds, and the third time wait 12 seconds, or pick a random number. Suddenly you've got every second, like all these things, the retry reconnect storm just goes crazy.
And what's so sad is there is a mechanism that's been in Ethernet for years, the CSMA-CD, collision, multiple access, multi-detect algorithm.
It's easy for you to say.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think it on the fly. That handles this type of arbitration where multiple agents are trying to access a common resource. And in the day, it was the Ethernet bus. Right. But there's no reason why that public algorithm cannot be used on an application for retry.
Yeah, it could.
Well, it normally it would be done with TCP. The problem in this case was there was nothing at the server end to throttle the request. And Microsoft's answer was to intervene manually. Since it wasn't being done automatically in the code, they intervened manually and blocked access to ActiveSync until they could begin to recover the services. And then they manually allowed a few users at a time to come back online.
Which is like a manual rolling restart kind of approach.
So let's think about this from a performance engineering perspective. What I'm hearing is really there are two issues at play here from a performance engineering perspective. One is a design issue and how to handle this type of back off and retry situation. And two, kind of implicit in this, because they ran out of capacity in an area, there's a capacity planning problem where somebody was kind of a little bit of asleep at the switch, not watching the growth and the utilization of resources, and then all of a sudden you hit a point where you tipped over.
Well, it's one thing I'll say, I also call this kind of a blind performance issue because, one, ActiveSync is usually kind of something that runs in the background, set it and forget it, right? Or the first time you plug in, when you unplug, whatever. And then when you do have spikes, it's spikes of traffic you can see. They are known knowns, not to abuse the Donald Rumsfeld school of epistemology. But it's the unknown. The things they shouldn't have known is, wow, what if? The classic what if performance test says, what if all of a sudden these background people, they start going into this rollback storm? So a good tester didn't design for a test at that scale. This is a great outage. What else did you find, John?
Well, okay, so that was Microsoft, right? And then on that same day, you mentioned a few minutes ago, Mark, the issue with New York Times, and it was a short outage, about 2 hours. It happened on the same day as Microsoft's outage as well, but it's a big name service that obviously is shifting its revenue stream from print to online services. And so when there's an outage of New York Times, it's obviously painful to their business. And this, again, was one of those. Now, in the case of Microsoft, we would expect some level of technical explanation of the cause and the remedy. Perhaps New York Times, we wouldn't expect so much, but their only comment about it was that it was, quote, an internal issue, end quote. There was no description of what the internal issue was.
Yes.
It might have been sabotage, it might have been failed equipment, it might have been human error, but they gave no insight
it was
whatsoever.
Definitely not a radiation flash from a sunspot. That would be an external issue.
Right.
Right, an internal issue. Now, I don't feel so bad for the New York Times, but remember, New York Times was one of the first online publications. They caught a lot of heat for starting to charge for content online. They were I think they were even on the first iPhone, weren't they? I think they were one of the first in magazines to be you could get on the newsstand. In fact, I think it's the only magazine I have in my newsstand on my iPhone. And they caught a lot of heat for charging for content in the online versions and such. And it's like, okay, so since you guys took a lot of heat with your reputation on charging for that content, what did you do with that money? Did you buy infrastructure? Did you pay for training to make sure your ops guys are up to speed on the perfect process? Did you get redundancies in? It's like, I don't feel so bad for these guys.
They used it to buy new printing presses so they could print paper.
Now, recently I was surfing the internet and I noticed it was kind of quiet. It turns out it was just, not much traffic. Usually you hear the noise, the din of the packet load coming through your router. But during this barrage of outages, this attack of nothingness when everything dies, Google.com, like Gmail, all of Google, I don't know if it was all of Google, went down. And John, you reported it was a 40% dip in overall internet traffic everywhere.
That's correct. And here's the remarkable thing. Oh my God. You would expect that if Google were out of service for an hour or 2 hours, there would be such a massive backlash. But we're talking about an outage that lasted primarily for about 1 minute. And at that time, the failed searches were somewhere in the range of 50 to 70%. So somewhere around 30 to 50% of the online queries were getting through.
Right.
And within about 4 minutes, all of their services had been restored. So what you saw was just from that instantaneous outage, the traffic dropped to about 60% of its normal worldwide volume.
And John, I believe you have a number on the revenue impact of this to Google.
It was over 100. Just their revenue alone was over $100,000 for the first minute.
For the first minute.
Right.
And that's what, if we still actually charged for long distance calls, isn't that, it's like $100,000 for the first minute and $200,000 for every additional minute or something? No, I'm just kidding. That's not a lot of money to a company like Google, right? I mean,
right. It's a drop in the bucket to them.
Yeah, it is.
The bigger issue really is the kind of the black eye as a cloud service provider taking an outage like that.
Yeah. I mean, how many I know I do almost all of my email work is through Gmail, even though I have several different domains. It's all done through Gmail online for free.
And of course, Gmail was one of the services that went out.
Oh yeah, big time.
When they failed.
Now, I had heard some estimates that people had trouble up to 30 minutes getting back totally restored, and that may have been Gmail independently because it took time to rev all those accounts back up. But even in just 5 minutes, a total of 5 minutes, that's, for the first minute, $500,000 is crazy. And again, you just got to question, like, people, let's all go to the cloud. The cloud's going to be awesome. And then we're all in this shared infrastructure. All it takes is whatever. And I don't know. I don't see any explanation online from Google as to why. No transparency whatsoever from what that is, because it makes them look really bad.
So Mark, you mentioned the cloud. I've been driving around the country for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And I can tell you late at night, looking at the clouds, sometimes those clouds are angry. They kick off sparks, lightning. they throw off rain. So you get unhappy clouds. And that happens on the internet as well.
Yeah. Unhappy clouds. That's okay. I think we were talking about electronic clouds for sure. So Google, again, big name. We got Microsoft and Google. Big names that should be taking the money that you do spend on them. I spend a little bit of money for my Google Drive, which was also down. Couldn't get to Google Drive. All my work is done out there. Thanks.
But Mark, I think Google
what are they doing?
Pales in comparison to really our next outage.
Yes.
Which is NASDAQ.
Well, even before we get to them, don't forget we lost Amazon for about a half an hour for the online merchant, Amazon.com site.
Let's back up a little bit here. All right, so John, what the heck happened with Amazon.com? Because they have been the poster child. I'm going to have to stop using them as an example of a site that stays up and does. What happened at Amazon.com?
The Amazon outage was on the 19th, so that was just about a day and a half after Microsoft came up. Amazon went down, and then NASDAQ went down a couple days after that. So Amazon.com suffered an outage that wasn't too long, about a half an hour's worth. The UK site was not affected. The US site, the Canadian sites were affected, and perhaps it wouldn't have been such a big deal. We might have been able to get around it, except following on the heels of the Google outage, having Amazon then go down, of course, raised many eyebrows.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed we started trying to tie those together.
Yeah, like, is this a coordinated effort?
The issue of potential sabotage. Was there something related to backlash from Snowden and Prism against the major, merchants of the United States and symbols of capitalism?
Yep. Now, I had heard a roundabout number on one of the morning talk shows that put the estimate for sales, just lost sales, Amazon.com, in that 30 minutes at $2 million. $2 million. Let me do the math here. What does that translate to? 2 million.
I think that one estimate was about $1,100 a minute. I think was one official's estimate of the outage.
Yeah, so that'd be 1.98 million would be $1,100 a minute, which would be good. That could be my rate if we were to help them do some consulting. It would be approximately $1,100 a minute to help them solve their problems. I think that would be a fair rate.
Just don't send your bill on Outlook.com.
via your Gmail address. Okay, awesome.
Well,
so Amazon.com.
We should come back to Amazon in a few minutes because we're not done with them.
Oh, we're not done with Amazon. Those wonderful guys. And then the people who would want, we've got Microsoft, we've got Google, we've got New York Times, we've got Amazon.com. And then, of course, the guys on Wall Street probably want to start trading because all of the news is so bad about these outages. And so they go to the NASDAQ and they start doing some trading, and what happens?
Boom.
The NASDAQ goes down.
Right. So, James, do you want to talk about that?
Now, this is a really interesting one because they called it a flash freeze.
Yeah, different than the flash crash, which was the one a couple years ago, 2010, right?
Yeah, so freeze to me implies a deadlock condition. You have so many transactions trying to get a lock on a common resource, and none of them can get it, and none of them are a candidate for the deadlock to say, okay, you don't get the lock, you go away.
Yeah.
And the whole system just comes to a screeching halt.
I think, John, it was different. The freeze they're talking about was intentional to.
Right. The freeze was the freezing of all the Tape C funds in response to the outage in the NASDAQ, and then that was followed by a similar, what you'd call a freeze, at the New York Stock Exchange ARCA system.
Yeah.
So they were describing it, the most technical explanation I heard that seemed reasonable was that the NASDAQ's servers were running short on memory in trying to process these tape C transactions, and essentially it ran out of memory, and that was when it crashed. It was essentially handling transactions in connection with the New York Stock Exchange.
Right. Garbage collection? Didn't we just talk about garbage collection and memory on the last show, James?
I believe we did.
We did.
Yeah.
And again, this one, lack of testing. How long is this been? How long do you think, John, has this server been processing tape C?
Decades.
Decades. Why go out of memory now? Was either you weren't monitoring, you didn't do basic math on easy capacity planning to figure out you were about to run out of memory.
Or, oops, new release and no time for test.
New release, no time for test. Probably a release. Could be a bug. And
This is one of those interesting cases where the outage occurs on an interface between essentially two competitors, NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
So it's obviously going to be difficult to have agreement on all sides about who was really to blame, and already the finger pointing has begun. One against the other.
Yeah, it's like that township line road between two counties, and then one county wants to take accountability for it. So it's the worst road in 40 miles is that road. One side gets resurfaced, and then the other one has potholes, and then next year it's the other way around, and no one drives on that road because we can't decide. It's like a DMZ. It should be a DMZ. What is it in Star Trek? The neutral zone?
Yeah, it's the neutral zone between the Romulan Empire and the rest of the civilized universe.
Exactly. So I think when we rewrite those treaties, there should be some performance monitoring requirements by each party to enter the neutral zone in order to add memory to the server. I think would be advised. Okay. So
just to put that into context before we leave our buddies in New York.
Oh, yes.
That freeze essentially affected almost $6 trillion worth of U.S. equities. That's about a third of the entire U.S. stock market was affected by that freeze.
Yeah. So if you were in the long game with your retirement funds, if you weren't a day trader, this is just a blip on the radar screen. But if somebody was doing major movements, and this happened on a Friday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Fridays are a crazy trading day. We like to end with the market up, so we go into the weekend feeling good. And it is the summer vacation. All those New York guys are headed off to the Hamptons, from their
But oddly enough, it didn't happen as other items have done on like a triple witching hour where we have contract expirations and things of that nature, where we would have some sort of normal surge activity taking place.
Yeah.
It just happened, kind of like, a lazy Friday in August.
Which seems like a good candidate to do some releases to that server because they figure it's a downtime and no one cares. And sure enough, they picked the low risk.
The worst part of it was they brought it up at 4:00 in the afternoon. So granted, that was longer than some of the engineers wanted to wait before bringing back online.
Yeah.
But can you imagine being part of the team who already had demonstrated a lack of sufficient testing, planning, and recovery to be the team now that has to say, at 4:00 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, we're going to bring this entire system that's crashed and been down for 4 hours back up online for a little bit of trading at the end of the week? I would not want to be the person to put my name on the dotted line saying she's ready to go.
Oh, yeah. You think the floor traders have a stressful job. That's they do it every day, but those AT guys were at like 3x the stress for that 15 minutes. Amazing. Amazing story. Okay.
It was kind of interesting, too, because, not long after that, actually, just today, the largest derivatives market in Europe, the DB1, also went out of service for a while. So we're not the only ones, right? So it doesn't just happen to us. It can happen overseas as well.
Yes. So before we go on with the continued episode for the News of the Damned, we'll take a little break for a word from our sponsor.
Hosting for PerfBytes.com has been provided by NewCo, New Centers of Excellence in Performance Engineering, PowerTest Professional Services, The Script Farm, LoadRunner by the Hour, Videratech, Cloud Architect, and No-Load Test. For more information, go to www.newcoe.com or call 703-856-8187.
Okay, so let's recap what we've covered so far with the news of the damned. We've got Microsoft right at the top. Now, I remember Hotmail went down, then there was MSN. There were all sorts of outages when they did the first cable modem integration and the MSN routers, and now they've become Outlook.com. Outlook, which has this long history as being the professional email tool on your desktop. They're going to move Outlook.com. Everything's Outlook.com, and boom, Outlook.com goes down. The big guys, Microsoft. The next one we covered, New York Times, little media, big sort of the first big pay-for-content online publishing promising, they take a small hit and go down. Google, and not just a small name, Google, giant Google. Your Gmail was gone for a minute, and that cost them about $400,000, $500,000 to be in that period of time. Then Amazon.com, the marketplace. You can't go shopping. One of the biggest e-commerce e-tailers in the world takes a hike for about 30 minutes. That cost them $2 million or $1,100 per minute. So just a quick note before we go forward with the news of the damned. If you're thinking you don't need to invest money, real capital, real resources, real effort into doing performance testing, go back and listen to the first half of this show, because these are big companies, billion-dollar Fortune 100 companies that are suffering from a lack of performance testing and robust performance characteristics in their infrastructure, in their applications, you name it.
And right now, you need to be making your disaster plan for when this happens to you on Black Friday, Cyber Monday, day before Christmas, day after Christmas,
or if you're NASDAQ, just any random Friday.
True.
Exactly, right? So what's up next on our list? Because the list we got another 5 or 6 to go here, don't we?
Yeah, well, yes, we do have a few left. The next one's a kind of a small online company known as eBay.
Yeah, aren't they just a fun little startup? They haven't been around much in the internet.
Only 4 letters. How big could they be?
Yeah, exactly.
So they announced that they were going to be doing some maintenance and that there might be some intermittent problems, but then apparently the problems were more serious and less intermittent and more constant than they expected. They started experiencing the problems, according to the reports, around 8 o'clock in the morning Greenwich Mean Time.
Yes.
This was in the UK site.
Yeah.
And this was one of those cases, depending on who is the source of the information, one can get more or less detailed insight as to what's going on. For example, in Microsoft's case, they actually explained to some level of technical insight exactly what they were doing to remedy the problem. So in eBay's case, what they told their customers was this: we're sorry that intermittent problems with eBay have continued for longer than planned. So in other words, they had some plan that customers were going to have problems.
Yes.
We're working hard to resolve the issue. In other words, they don't know how long it's going to take to fix.
Yeah.
And we will provide a further update soon. So they don't know exactly when they're going to be telling.
After they figure out what the problem is.
Exactly.
Which requires them to work hard, meaning not doing anything and then starting to do something is hard. So
obviously, if you're going to have a problem like this, when it's online, your exposure to the market is pretty large.
Oh, yeah.
And the impact that the eBay outage had was that a number of businesses and consumers began tweeting about it. So the tweet space lit up with problems about eBay.
Yeah.
And that's certainly one of the worst ramifications of an outage.
It's really difficult. It's really difficult.
But what we didn't have a Twitter outage as a result.
No, so kudos. Maybe our inverse this week will be anyone who doesn't show up on this list. Well, it'll come. Twitter's been up and down. They've been up and down so often. I don't think you can say it's good or bad. They just sort of it happened again. But that's because Twitter to some folks is not mission critical. eBay though, eBay, I mean, I feel really bad because to some people, their entire livelihood is running auctions. And brick and mortar companies that do, let's say, pawn shops or antiques, or I mean, one of the original, you look at the Etsy success as a competitor of, individual sort of merchants that their entire livelihood is online. Maybe they live in the middle of nowhere selling, little birdhouses made out of, pine trees, cones or something, and they sell it all through eBay, and eBay's gone. Their entire livelihood is gone. So that's a heck of a lot of responsibility. And as opposed to Twitter, you can wait 15 minutes to send your hate mail if Twitter's down.
So to use the Twitter analogy for just a moment, one of the more difficult parts of the eBay outage was that it was not simply out of service and then later on came back on. For example, if we look at what happened to NASDAQ, given that there is a great deal of regulation and oversight, we have an executive decision that we're going to shut down all of the Tape C trading, and then it's not going to start again until we say so. In the case of eBay, what would happen was it was intermittent outages, and this is even worse. So the people would think that it was back up online and begin to do additional transactions, then have it quit again, and have it come up and have it quit. And so sometimes when we're doing performance testing and load testing, we say, okay, well, at this level we're operating perfectly. At this level we see some degradation. At this level we see complete failure. In the case of online services, especially where money's involved, intermittent failure can sometimes be worse than a complete outage.
Yeah, I think that's right, because you don't have a clear-cut expectation on how for these individual merchants or customers, their users, to manage their current auctions. And I think eBay, just looking at the intricacy of that, how you use the site to do these kinds of auctions, I'm not sure that there's not many options to survive this kind of outage, right? You have to come up fully functioning or not. I mean,
especially imagine people who are bidding, right, on a particular item. If you have an item for sale and the outage takes place at such a time that your bidding no longer continues and you end up selling for a much lower bid than you ought to have,
right,
it can have a devastating effect to the merchants.
Yeah, I completely agree. So the impact is much farther. I wonder if eBay wouldn't consider, during this maintenance period, there's a special arbitration process, because I know they have a formal arbitration process to mediate and resolve issues that they have. Maybe they have a special way to do is
shut the system down
with an expected your outage.
Yes.
But yeah, that's a tough one. So you've got eBay as an auction site, which is sort of the main infrastructure for some people's complete livelihood. And once again, our old friends at Amazon, just a couple of days later, the Amazon infrastructure, which is also mission critical to how many companies nowadays, including Twitter and Tumblr and all these other really hip new startup sites.
And Mark, even PerfBytes, we have an instance at Amazon EC2 in Virginia, the very data center impacted.
There you go.
Right. So just to be clear for all of our listeners, we're now talking about Amazon Web Services, whereas before we were talking about Amazon Com eMerchant.
Right.
They reported that their EBS volumes, which are part of the ECS data store, were beginning to report launch errors and packet loss, which isn't something you normally would associate with kind of a typical network error, right?
No.
So there were two problems. That was the first problem they reported. Then approximately 10 minutes later, what seems to be unrelated, they had a problem with their load balancing algorithms. So on one hand, you have a problem on the back end. About 10 minutes later, before the first problem resolved, you have a second problem on the front end with the load balancer. So now imagine you've got these companies that are depending on Amazon Web Services. So, Instagram, Netflix, Vine, Airbnb.
Yep.
And so now these companies, which are depending on Amazon Web Services, who at this point, very early in the situation, don't have a clear picture of where the problem lies, are in kind of an isolated situation. Is it you or is it me?
Yeah.
Right? This is when, when you're having a problem with a connection to one of your clients, for example, is it my PBX, my internet connection, or is it the client, or is it one of the service providers in the middle? And what's interesting, we kind of go back and do a little bit of forensics. Instagram came up about 10 minutes after the second outage, and Instagram said that they'd identified the issue and they were working to fix it as soon as possible. I'm not sure how Instagram would have been able to know what the issue was, but here, it's one of those things where you're under a great deal of pressure because you have a major outage, and they thought they knew what the situation was. As it turns out, the total outage of all the systems for some users was up to 4 or 5 hours.
4 or 5 hours. That's what I read as well. And I think if you think about Instagram being bought by Facebook, and that maybe there's some Instagram infrastructure that's still running and stretched out on Amazon, obviously. So I'm wondering if you're the head PM for integrating Instagram to run on the Facebook platform, if you're, punching yourself in the head, like, why didn't I get the heck off of that infrastructure? But it could be that they were working to fix it by getting all those remaining Instagram services instances off of Amazon and onto the Facebook app infrastructure. Because I know that integration process is ongoing. But yeah, I mean, you can't. We're just taking a risk. Who would have thought there's a risk in letting your app just run in the cloud? The cloud's always up. It's infinite. It performs. It scales. It solves all your problems. It's so much different than just a guy in the garage down the street with a bunch of hardware. Isn't it? Because to me, this sounds like, oh, well, there's some stuff running in the data center down the street there, and I guess something happened. But this is the second time I think that particular Virginia data center has been on News of the Dam, James. Because I think, didn't we have him on there once before when I think the cleaning crew tripped over an extension cord in one of the racks?
I'll have to go back and look on that one, Mark.
All right.
But it's entirely plausible.
Yes.
So before we let go of Amazon and let them escape scot-free, there's one other troubling piece of information that came out of that. Aside from knowing the profound business impact of this outage, we talked earlier about how we could forgive New York Times for not providing us with a very complex technical explanation of exactly what happened, why we would expect something like that from Microsoft.
Sure.
But now we're talking about Amazon Web Services, which arguably is in some ways more technical on the back end in infrastructure than maybe even Amazon.com. When we talk about just how reliable it has to be, how complex the billing and the tracking is. So when this was all said and done, Amazon's explanation for the outage was it was a partial failure of a networking device. A partial failure of a networking device. That's what caused these two problems.
So the switch was up, but for some reason the wires weren't plugged in?
Well, so then...
I think someone plugged in a crossover cable.
Oh. An infinite loopback brought... Oh.
It was a crossover cable between the engineers who fixed the problem and the public relations specialist who wrote the statement.
Yes. When no one... That's not funny how that works out. Upstream, when before something like this happens, the marketing department never calls the IT guys. But as soon as something terrible happens, the IT guys talk to the PR department.
In this case, they should have spoken more because, as we said, we're talking about two completely unrelated problems, right? One is on the back end on the ECS database. The other one's on a load balancer. And these two unrelated problems, they're saying, are both related to partial failure of a networking device.
Yes. Yeah. Again, the guy with a bunch of hardware in his garage down the street is going to run your app. And you totally trust that person. You're going to keep your switches and stuff working, right? They're not going to overheat, or they don't have a mean time to failure. They're not going to, right, man? And, the guy goes, oh, yeah, no worries, just reading the fine print, where if it goes out, oh, well, tough crap, whoops. Oh, the fine print. Read the fine print from your cloud provider. And I will say on this one, like anyone, if you only run your clusters on a single cloud provider, boy, that's the huge risk. And it may cost you money, but just get your global DNS and make sure you're routing traffic with failovers to other cloud providers. It's not that hard to configure. All right. So the next one, and there's always more. We've talked a bit about online commerce, and most of these companies they're tech companies, except for the New York Times, NASDAQ Finance. So we got another company here that would not be traditionally a tech company, but they are a big, well-known bank in Australia, Westpac. And so shout out to our friends down under who are suffering when their Westpac's online banking went down. Apparently, the entire online banking part of Westpac was down for a number of days and then came back up and then went down again on Friday. So here's another wonderful banking, NASDAQ trades, whatever. And this is a major bank. I happen to know that they've used over the years 2 or 3 of the major vendors from load testing. They have a central performance center of excellence. They've worked with some of the top performance folks around the Australia, New Zealand. And still this is having issues. The ATMs networks were out. James, where did you just read that one?
Westpac not only impacted online, but it impacted transactions at their ATMs for people trying to get money. So it wasn't across the entire ATM network, but for every Westpac ATM and Westpac online transactions, those were impacted.
Yeah. And so here's something where a bank, and banks usually have a fair amount of money to reinvest into technology, and online banking has gone through the roof in terms of maybe even the only way people manage their personal or even business funds now. And these guys are having some major outages. It sounds like an infrastructure issue to me, but again, could be caused by application performance. But their statements were more earnest.
We take system reliability extremely seriously. We are very disappointed by inconvenience to our customers and will undertake a thorough review. Our sincerest apologies to all and thanks for your patience.
That's the statement that they wrote 2 or 3 years ago, just in case there were ever a problem.
Just in case there were a problem, that they had to deliver. You want to be prepared for any.
So I've got a question for this last just-in story related to China. Could this be the source of many of the outages?
It's unlikely. So there was a major outage in China, and it's sort of interesting because China is widely respected for having some of the leading communications cracking technology in the world. But once an external force gains a path through the firewall, China has almost no defenses against a well-designed attack. And in this case, it appears to be a distributed denial of service attack against some of the DNS servers for the .cn domain. And the way they described it was that there was an initial attack at around 2 a.m. China time, and then it was followed by a more intense attack at about 4 a.m., and they described this as the largest denial of service attack that China has ever faced. Now imagine the magnitude of that statement. The largest denial of service attack that China has ever faced. That's massive.
It's got to be bigger than, you want obviously shy away from saying the largest denial of service attack ever in the world, in the history of the world. But
it has to be close.
It has to be close. Just in
now, I did see a posting in a public forum about someone attempting to use JMeter to test Alibaba.com. You don't think this was related to that, do you?
No. I think that's hosted in a totally different place.
Okay.
Yeah. Only a few of the episodes in the last year from News of the Damned have really been DDoS, distributed denial of service, or just plain old denial of service from a specific location. And this is a particular attack that's fairly well known, and there's actually a lot of newer technology, the Cisco technologies, and some of the other switching infrastructure companies that even your IDS or your low-level infrastructure devices against this at this point, right? So yeah, so I'm wondering
if the infrastructure that they would have in place near the firewall would be from Cisco or perhaps from Huawei. They both would have some of the same code, of course.
They would have a lot of the same code. The other thing is 32% drop in traffic.
Mm-hmm. So when we talked about Google going out for 1 to 4 minutes and hitting global traffic by about 40%, this outage in China took about a third of the Chinese traffic on the internet down with it. And so this was an outage that we're talking about somewhere in the range of about 4 hours. A third of the traffic in China didn't go through.
And John, I think in China, this actually has a larger impact overall than a 40% outage for Google here.
Right.
Simply because most of those devices that are internet connected in China, if I'm not mistaken, are smartphones.
Yes, and they're also directly linked to a lot of the businesses over there. So you're talking about a country that's heavily dependent upon the nationwide infrastructure for manufacturing and labor. So you would expect that the costs to the nation of China would be enormous from this outage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things that you had just posted in our notes here, John, was that there's suspicion, even from China, that they said this may well have been a single individual pulling this off because it wasn't distributed, or because they actually probably maybe sourced an IP address where all of this traffic was coming from?
Well, the reason was that it was a very simple attack.
Okay,
it wasn't something very sophisticated that they would, for example, associate with, the NSA or the Mossad or somebody. This was an attack that a reasonably well-equipped cracker could have launched.
Yes.
And it's a little bit curious, I suppose, that it happened right after the trial of Bo Xilai. But on the other hand, are we just drawing that conclusion because of the coincidence of the events? Just like we were saying, well, is it a coincidence that Amazon has an outage just after Google and Microsoft? It's hard to say. It could be purely coincidence.
Purely coincidence. And I know
I think this was the China market reaction to Steve Ballmer going to retire.
So in other words, because he's retiring, Apple will do well and all the factories will be running at quadruple capacity.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention also a little bit about what's, sometimes it's a lack of a tool that leads people into these outage situations. Let's just go around the horn. James, if you're in a situation, what are the first 3 tools you would bring to the table in response if one of these customers were to call you up and say, help me out with an outage? What would be the first 3 tools you would reach for?
Oddly enough, Mark, there are going to be some log analysis tools.
Oh yeah,
they're going to be log parser. There's going to be Splunk, and I might actually look at a network trace using Wireshark.
Okay,
but because I want to understand where the problems occurred and what the cascade effects of the initial problem were. Logs are authoritative. Network traces are authoritative. You're not wondering whether Bob was looking at the server at the time that it burped green acrid smoke.
Yes.
So you can go back and get a historical feel for what has happened.
Okay. So log parsing, network tracing, that would be pretty good. I would jump into the database maybe as well, some tracing at the database layer. Maybe. John, what are your thoughts?
From my background, it's very heavy into network analysis tools.
Sure.
So not just Wireshark, but some of the higher-end analytic and troubleshooting software packages. And if the customer has been proactive enough to install them in advance, some of the probe tools, for example, something from NetScout or Gigamon that's going to capture the transactions in advance of the outage.
Yeah, so asking, if people had certain types of monitoring or that type of logged information available prior to the incident.
Yeah, but Mark, what we're seeing here for you, myself, and John is that we're going to some sort of record which is non-volatile. It's not subject to interpretation.
Right.
That we're using as part of our analysis, because as soon as you ask 5 different people for what happened on a box, you're going to get 5 different answers.
I think that's a very insightful thing to say, James, because usually if you bring an application performance tester into an outage situation, they're at a different level in the stack. And, the bottlenecks mean something different if you're just looking at sort of logic-based bottlenecks versus serious, this processor is running at 100%, or the queue length is finally, exhausted the timeout. So the time in the queue is beyond its threshold. Something empirical at the lower level of the infrastructure. And I would agree with that as well. I think it's incredibly hard to find the right information prior to an outage. An outage happens, and there's a million moving, spinning plates, and part of the reason there's an outage is that one of those plates is not doing well. So if you walk into a situation, you're not monitoring, at least just capturing, the sort of the old adage. I think it's a John Allspaw adage from the Etsy world, which was, if it moves, graph it. If you can log stash something, log parse, Splunk's a great example. Keep an eye on these things, ebb and flow, moving up, moving down, etc. Right? In your experience, looking at this, it's starting to look at key resources, as James points out, from a very low level in the infrastructure, something that's quote-unquote non-volatile. So networking is a great place to start for some of these outages, like Amazon was load balancing, right?
Right. So one of the reasons that I like to do that is that it takes away the isolation of one endpoint, because if nothing else, if we can determine one of the challenges we have is that if we're looking at, for example, the database, we have to make sure that what the database believes that it sends out actually went there, because we're talking about a networked application. And so not only are we worried about how the individual platform is behaving, but we have to look at how are the connections between them. Just to use NASDAQ as an example, the problem in the NASDAQ case was the interface between NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. So there may be servers involved in the equation, but ultimately it's the traffic between those servers that is actually the root cause of that particular outage.
That is to say, it's a quick way of identifying where within the system the problem is.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean you find the solution, but it's easy to find out whether the problem is at the server, for example, or at the client or at the database by looking at what's flowing between them.
Yeah. So my tip to everyone out there, having been in this situation many times, some of these companies did a marvelous job, such as Google, which was down for a minute and pretty much back up in 4 minutes, I think, right, John?
Yes.
It's just pretty remarkable recovery time. And that's a big thing when it comes to a DevOps, sort of the principles of DevOps. It's not the end of the world if the site goes down, but if it stays down, you're in big trouble. That's where it costs a lot of money. So recovery and the art of recovery or responding to an outage is extremely important, almost more important than the preventative measures. Or at least as important as the preventative measures. When you're coming into an outage situation, I'll give you 3 tips, and that is to divide your team at least into 3 departments. One effort will look at, as John and James point out, look at the empirical evidence leading up to, the forensics before the outage, I will say. This team will basically do the effort of trying to figure out what happened. It's important they should come back with something within like the first 24 hours with a plausible suspect of this is what we exactly think was the cause of the outage. And this is something that's ongoing and trying to determine exactly the root cause, because that's valuable not only to potentially the politics. You're an organization. Sometimes you want to fire somebody. Somebody's got to take the fall, and that happens if your organization is very political. Or it's also just to figure out how to prevent this from happening in the future, creating a secondary or tertiary solution that would solve that. So while that team is getting to work, because especially if the CIO is pounding on the door, what the heck happened, they're going to want some answers. At the same time, you have to get the business up and running. So the second team is going to jump right in and start basically getting the site back up as fast as possible. So this team, nobody's going to be asking questions about, who pointing fingers at this and it wasn't my fault and whatever. It's get down to business and get to work and get the system back up. Even if it's just a simple page, putting up the basics of the website, just anything to return business back to operating. And those 2 teams have to work in parallel and maybe share some information. So the third team is really kind of the cover team, right? They are sort of the not the hot potato, but the follow-up team. They sort of run interference for the other two teams. So if there's something to follow up on, if there's something maybe political or bureaucratic that has to be resolved, even financial things, if you need to requisition more hardware, if you need to requisition another cloud provider, and you need those processes to happen concurrently, you need this third team that is sort of politically connected. They're also the communication bus for the other two teams. So they're sort of runners and handoffs. So those are kind of the three different breakups of teams that I've seen be very effective. Again, one team is doing the forensics. The other team is tactical triage and get the thing basically back up and running. And the third team is sort of the management layer that makes sure everyone gets pizza and nobody, blows up and gets too stressed and they follow up on all the other stuff. James, do you have any other tips for, getting, you and I have been on a SWAT team a couple of times together.
Yeah, that third layer is really essential. If you think of, there are many different management styles, but at the core, managers should be responsible for removing barriers to you doing your job. That third team, removing barriers in delivery, such as logistically getting you more hardware,
sure,
barriers in food and beverage, or just barriers in politics to move the thing forward. Without that third team being very essential but non-technical for the most part, those other two teams are not going to be successful.
Yeah, exactly. So that's our tip to how to not end up on the news of the damned. You might still end up there, but at least you won't lose your job. But it's also a tip as we go into the holidays, because this is the pressure is on for a lot of the companies in the U.S. Cyber Monday, Black Friday, James, you mentioned already. But that sort of brings us to the largest, an entire show of the news of the damned, James.
I really only have one thing to say to that.
Really? All right.
Can you dig it?
I can dig it. So thank you, PerfBytes listeners, once again for listening to yet another brain-rattling episode of PerfBytes. We always thank you for taking the time to listen to the show, and we hope you learned a few things, not only about these particular outages, but how to handle them. And, of course, special thanks to John Curtis for joining us. John, it was really nice to have your research. I really appreciate that. And you're always welcome to join us on any episode of PerfBytes. I will say thank you to the sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes, who is always supportive and always sexy and always Irish.
I would like to thank my mother for listening to the show. That way we're always guaranteed at least one listener.
At least one fantastic listener. Thank you to James' mom.
Today's show was powered by gluten-free beer.
Gluten-free beer, because even if you have a gluten intolerance, you shouldn't have to forego the wonderful pleasures of brewed beer. And let me remind you that, of course, today's PerfBytes, all of the content on any PerfBytes episode is copyrighted and protected by the similar technology to that little firewall that's built into your home Wi-Fi router, because it's totally secure and it's going to protect everything, right? And yeah, the upcoming episode of PerfBytes, actually, here's an announcement for the upcoming Software Test Professionals in October. We will be doing a PerfBytes live episode again, celebrating the 1-year anniversary, the first year of PerfBytes.
And definitely somebody is going to win a pair of shoes.
A pair of PerfBytes shoes. Please check out Software Test Professionals, stpcon.com for more information. You can always, of course, follow us on the perfbytes.com website. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Quick. You can follow us on Tumblr. You can follow us on thepracticalperformanceanalyst.com. Actually, shout out to Trevor. There's also testingpodcasts.com. Michael Ensminger put us on testingpodcast.com, so you can find PerfBytes there as well. Of course, you can always listen to us in iTunes. Just go to the iTunes, open up the store, and look for, type in PerfBytes, and you'll find the only PerfBytes podcast that's out there is our PerfBytes podcast, which is pretty wonderful. If you have any questions for PerfBytes, you can send us an email at ask@perfbytes.com. You can also call us and leave us a voicemail at 775-623 7373. Thanks again for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode of PerfBytes.